Hello, everybody, and welcome. We're so glad to see a number of people here tonight on our online Policy on Tap. This is a regular series called Policy on Tap that the Citizens League uh, uses to bring together people to talk about important policy and issues for our state. Because of COVID, we've been on pause the last few months. So this is actually a great night for all of us because it's the reboot in an online form of Policy on Tap. So we're really happy that everyone is here. Citizens League, for those of you who don't know, is a nonpartisan, it's a nonprofit organization that empowers people to engage in civic life and in public policy. So we thank you for your support. When you signed up, there was an optional donation. We thank you for that, but we also encourage you to go to citizensleague.org to join up and keep encouraging that great public policy. So on to the show. The election is over. The counting continues. I just checked the New York Times about 10 minutes ago. They just called another race. It's the Senate race in North Carolina. So we know that the counting is continuing. Here in Minnesota, yesterday was the last day that the state would accept ballots if they had been mailed and postmarked by election day. So there were even a few votes still coming in over the past few days. But we do generally know what Minnesota politics will look like. So we're going to talk about it with two great reporters who cover this every day. Briana Bierschbach writes for the Star Tribune, and Ricardo Lopez reports for the online news site Minnesota Reformer. So hello to both of you. Thank you both for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And Ricardo, and you're just still on mute, just so you know, Ricardo, you posted on social media this week that you were able to get away for a few days to go to a yurt. So all yurt related questions, please give to Ricardo in this event here tonight. I do obviously have some questions and we'll have this discussion, but if you want to ask a question, if you're watching here tonight, if you go to the bottom of your screen, it's where it says Q&A. I know a lot of you on Zoom are used to using the chat function to ask questions, but we're not going to use that. We're going to use Q&A. So use Q&A and submit your questions, and I'll try to incorporate as many of them as I can in this conversation. So just to generally start, nothing is totally final. Maybe a few more numbers here to add to the tallies, but what are your general takeaways from the Minnesota results specifically? Briana, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I think, like always in Minnesota, a pretty fascinating result, right? I mean, we had, never have I seen before a situation where the winning candidate hits a high watermark, or the losing candidate, I should say, Donald Trump in Minnesota, hits a high watermark of votes in the state. And the winning candidate, Joe Biden, hits another historic high watermark. So it was, were just shy of 80% turnout, I think, as of the last ballots that came in. Which I'm sure is gnawing at Secretary of State Steve Simon a little bit. I'm sure he would have loved to get to 80%, a nice even 80%, but we still look to be on track for #1 in the nation. So that's kind of standard for Minnesota elections, and also standard for Minnesota elections is a little bit of a puzzling result, right? You had Joe Biden win pretty handily at the top of the ticket, as well as Tina Smith, Democratic candidate, an incumbent for the U.S. Senate, but down ballot, they didn't seem to have a lot of coattails in legislative and congressional races. We saw the Senate, the Republicans maintain control of the Senate by a single vote, so a 1-vote majority there. And Democrats also maintain control of the House, but that has narrowed a little bit. It looks like we'll have about a 70-64 split there, and they had a much more comfortable margin before this election, which is a fascinating result. And we can kind of unpack, I'm sure, how that happened or why that happens. But that's a question we've been asking ourselves, and candidates have been over the last few days. Was it in a number of key races, third-party candidates? Was it, some of the defund the police messaging? That was a really big part of the attacks in the legislative races. Was it the pandemic and not being able to door knock? There's so many things that we're going to be looking at in the days to come, but it was a puzzling result, and it has a lot of implications for the session that's coming up, which I know we'll unpack as well. But legislators are staring down this huge budget deficit potentially. I mean, very likely we're going to get a new forecast in December, and a bunch of big issues, including continuing to respond to the pandemic and redistricting, which is a fun one that we only get to talk about every 10 years.
What would you add, Ricardo? And we are going to get to everything Briana talked about, but what would you add, Ricardo?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about the election result is that going into Election Day this year, you would have been hard pressed to have found a Democrat willing to express, really public confidence about their chances going into election day. I mean, even though we had a number of both national and state level polling showing that President Trump was trailing Vice President Joe Biden by significant margins in many states and nationally, no one wanted to get ahead of themselves and proclaim, we're feeling really good going to this election. In fact, there was a lot of anxiety being expressed among Democrats. And similarly, I mean, even at the national level, you saw a lot of confidence that Democrats would sort of sweep into the majority in the Senate. And we're seeing very similar, results, nationwide as we saw here in Minnesota in terms of how close some of these congressional races have been. And so I think that that's an interesting dynamic, because what ended up happening is that, Trump lost his, he got, I think, last count 216 or something electoral college votes to Joe Biden's. And, you still had Democrats feeling very downtrodden, right, about losing seats here in the Minnesota House, losing seats in the U.S. House, and just really kind of turning, looking at what's to blame here, right? Is it the lack of door knocking during the pandemic? Is it the lack of an effective rebuttal to the defund of the police rallying cry? And you're still sort of wondering. At least among Democrats, they're still wondering what happened, right?
Yeah.
Because we're seeing a lot of the same sort of status quo, heading into this upcoming session.
And that's a question actually we just got online here. To just expand on that for one moment more, Ricardo, because there was this difference between what happened in the local races, the more local races, and the statewide presidential and U.S. Senate. You asked the questions. Did it have to do with, Democrats not doing door knocking, or did it have to do with defund the police after George Floyd's murder? Do you have any thoughts? I mean, can we answer that, or is it?
Yeah, I mean, because we had a piece. I had a piece with my colleague Rylan on our site this week that sort of examined some of the reasons we had heard about. Why didn't we see more? Why didn't we see Democrats do as well as they had hoped or expected to do in the legislative races? And a big one, really did come down to, the defund the police rallying cry. I mean, I think, State Senator Jeff Hayden, who actually lost his primary race earlier this year, so he's outgoing, told me that he felt that as he called it, the sloppy way that the Minneapolis City Council went about trying to execute on that policy objective really hurt them. And you saw it very, very regularly throughout the campaign. There was the controversial remarks made by now State Representative-elect John Thompson, when he was in Hugo and then at that protest outside of Bob Kroll's house, comments that were denounced by Democratic leaders in the state. And there was even that fundraiser that the House DFL was set to host, that would have included him. But you saw Democrats, trying as best as they could to sort of distance themselves from this. But, as I talked to other sort of progressive activists, even folks who very much believe in that policy objective, would tell me, that phrase defund really was not a winning one for them, right? You can, one particular, messaging expert on the progressive side told me, we should try to accomplish those goals without using that word. So, I mean, that one was a really tough one for Democrats this campaign season.
It's interesting, Briana, because to the point about control of the Minnesota House and the Minnesota Senate, it was really strong in the races for the Senate. And a lot of the focus was on the suburbs. And we heard the rhetoric from Donald Trump saying, I'm going to save the suburbs. But he actually ended up doing worse in the suburbs than he did 4 years ago in Minnesota. Yet, to Ricardo's point, some of those pickups that the Senate DFL were hoping for in the suburbs didn't materialize. What's going on, Minnesota?
Yeah, well, what's really interesting, if you dig into some of these results too, is, where Donald Trump had good coattails for Republicans in rural districts, Joe Biden just didn't necessarily have that for Democrats in suburban districts. So that was a huge thing. I talked to a couple candidates who said when they analyzed the numbers in their race versus the number of ballots cast for president in their district, there were way more for the president race. They think candidates just didn't go all the way down their ballot. Or in some cases, they think they might have split their tickets. They might have voted for Joe Biden. They really wanted to vote against Donald Trump, but they might have felt, like Ricardo pointed out, some unease about some of the messaging they heard on the police. Maybe they were upset about COVID restrictions, which, I think was a bigger issue in some rural races where Democrats lost their seats. So I think those were big parts of it. Also, I heard from Democrats who did say the door knocking piece was a big deal, right? If you look at a race like Warren Limmer versus Bonnie Westland in Maple Grove, she lost by just a couple hundred votes. And she said, normally I would have been out door knocking. I would have been, doing that kind of retail politicking, and I would have been doing it for a long time, right? And maybe that wouldn't have made up the difference of 900 votes, but in some of these races where it's really close, those personal one-on-one connections can make the difference in some of these races. And I know in that race in particular, there was a last-minute push by Republicans to open a lot of doors.
So one more question on what you were saying, Ricardo, and then we'll move on to looking ahead, because I had a couple questions in the Q&A that are related to the defund the police message. Basically asking, so then if it's not saying defund the police, will we see a different terminology, a different phrase? What is the messaging? Especially if, I think Briana just said it, the things you want to accomplish may all be the same. It's just that label of defunding the police. Or is it already just out there so much that Republicans will always call it defund the police and that die is cast?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question for progressive activists. I mean, as I talked to one, it was like, George Floyd just created the space to sort of be filled in by the activists who had long, believed in this type of policy objective, and without, having the sort of luxury of poll testing a message, and without sort of, having that time to really flush it out. I mean, it just really took off, and so that was part of the problem. The other adage in politics is, like, if you're explaining, you're losing, right? And so, unfortunately, we live in a world that very often rewards the sort of short, quick soundbite, right? And so, the thing to throw out that phrase and to say, actually, that's not exactly what we mean this. I mean, you're already sort of starting to lose people, and you're already starting to make people uneasy. But I think that, that sort of phrase, is likely to die away. But and I could obviously be wrong about that going forward, but I think you're still going to see efforts to try to shift resources away from, because I think one thing that a lot of people can agree on is that police officers are playing the role of a lot of different, they're playing the role of mental health responder, they're playing the role of, first aid responder, law enforcement officer. I mean, that they're doing so much work for a single job, right? And it's just like, how are police expected to sort of cure all these societal ills that affect communities? And I think you might see, you're starting to see a lot more effort towards trying to shore up the departments in that way.
I saw a couple comments on our Q&A about restructure the police. Actually, also saw someone say, hey, these results were so different. Maybe it's just because it's 2020. That's the only thing we need to say, because it's 2020. One other note before we stay on state policy, I just want to point out that at the federal level, there were races for Congress, and every incumbent in Minnesota's congressional district who was in the U.S. House won, except for one. Colin Peterson lost in the western and northwestern part of Minnesota, which is the 7th district, to Republican Michelle Fischbach. I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time on that because I want to focus a lot on state policy, but I want to know that there was a Republican flip in our congressional delegate here in Minnesota. So as this happens, everybody who won this election, they're actually not taking office till next January. Tomorrow, there's a special session. So everyone who is currently a lawmaker, even if you lost this election, you still are in this special session tomorrow. What's happening there, Briana?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's been, in the days after the election, the both caucuses, or all 4 caucuses, I should say, have spent a lot of time figuring out their kind of internal leadership, having those votes, having those kind of uncomfortable decisions about, who's going to lead them for the next 2 years until everyone's up again because of redistricting, of course. And, there were some challenges. We ended up having status quo. So even coming to those next 2 years, we'll have a lot of the same leaders. But because of that, they haven't really been talking as much about what they're going to be doing in the special session. And of course, we've had 5 special sessions before this year where they did quite a bit. They passed a $1.9 billion bonding bill that had been kind of stuck in the works over the years. They passed, or since the legislative session ended. They passed a number of policing reform proposals, and a lot of the Republicans have kind of said in a lot of these, if we don't have agreement, let's just go home. We have other stuff we need to do, and of course the surge in cases, the COVID cases across the state, I think is going to make them even more careful about staying around in the building too long. Usually they come in and Republicans take a vote to end the emergency, the state of emergency, which it does take an affirmative vote in both houses, so in the House and the Senate, to actually end Governor Walz's emergency powers. So something like that is not unlikely. They might take that vote, but I've heard some buzz that they might not too, just because of a number of members not being in the room and maybe not doing that this time. Ricardo might know more, but it's been pretty quiet on what to expect. They have been pestering, Republicans have been pestering Governor Walz about starting to look at these projected budget deficits in this biennium and in the, starting to look at what can be saved, maybe going into the next 2-year budget. Maybe they make some noise about that potentially as well.
What have you heard, Ricardo?
Well, the one thing that I'm most curious about tomorrow is, given the COVID situation, right? We're seeing, the beginnings of a third wave here. And, obviously we saw Governor Walz yesterday sort of put in place a few more restrictions, the turning back of the dial, as he likes to call it. But tomorrow I'm going to be watching whether the debate in both chambers is a little different, right? Because I think, there was a lot of noise made, particularly by the president, around, watch, after the election, COVID will no longer be a thing. And we're seeing very clearly that that's not the case. And in fact, we're going, at least for the foreseeable future, until the new administration takes office, states will continue to be largely on their own to deal with the situation, right? And so I'm curious to see whether Republicans will be shifting their points on how the state reacts to the rise in COVID cases, based on a statement yesterday by State Senator Michelle Benson, who essentially said, she trusts people's personal responsibility more than government mandates to deal with it. I don't think that that's a really strong sign that they believe, the statewide level actions by state leaders will be the answer to what we're seeing.
So we have, just again, because now, so that's tomorrow's special session. And as Briana noted, maybe they'll just show up and just adjourn. There may be actually nothing, but maybe not. We'll see, right? We have no idea. So that's with the current legislature. And then in January, all the new members get sworn in. Those who lost or retired are no longer in the legislature. And so you'll have a governor who was not on the ballot this year, who is a Democrat, DFLer. The Minnesota House remains in DFL control, and then the Senate, as you noted, stays Republican, but now it's just by one vote, but it's a very important vote. So it's exactly the same makeup as it has been up to now. So hazard a guess, I won't hold you to it, but just give me your sense. What does this mean? The fact that it hasn't been universal party control on either side has meant roadblocks to agenda items up to this point, but they've also been able to come to agreement on some items. You mentioned the bonding bill, Briana. So what's the next session going to be like? What do you see as the top items on the bill, on the agenda?
Well, I can start on that. I mean, I think that they are going to have, the budget is going to really suck a lot of the oxygen out of the room. I mean, they're constitutionally required to balance the budget by the summer, or state government will go into a mode of shutdown. And we should note that this group of 3 leaders, Gazelka, Hortman, and Walz, have gotten an agreement on a budget before. They passed a 2-year budget together in 2019. It wasn't easy. They went into overtime. They did all the dark room, behind closed doors stuff that we lament a lot in the middle of that process. I can't even imagine how a major budget deficit debate is going to happen in COVID times, when I don't even know if there is a room that they're going to be going into. But that is really going to be the focus. How do is Democrats, I would expect, are going to push for some new revenues to help with that. How much of this $2 billion plus budget reserve that we have is used? Our Republicans are also be pushing for cuts. I really just expect that to dominate it, as well as response to the pandemic and tensions over that. I mean, we have the same cast of characters. We have the same, divided government that we had before, but there are more fraught dynamics here. There is a pandemic that has created a ton of tension between Republicans in the Senate and Walz in particular. There's ongoing lingering tensions over, as we've talked about, George Floyd's killing in Minneapolis police custody and the defund debate that came out of that. So it could be even more tense. They have this huge deficit, though, they have to tackle constitutionally. I imagine that to be the big entree.
So this is a question just as we talk about the budget, Ricardo, because one of the potential relief valves is if the federal government were to pass another response bill for COVID that included direct aid to states, whatever our budget deficit is because of the economic downturn might be alleviated, potentially, who knows, right? Eliminated. And everything Briana just talked about might be way less if that federal aid is there. What's the status of any type of federal aid?
Right. That's an interesting one, because I think that there's probably a lot more optimism that such a financial aid package would get passed by Congress, particularly under a Biden administration. I mean, I think, if President Trump had won re-election, you would still have another go at it. I mean, they went ahead and confirmed Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, which was something that they put ahead of a financial package like that. I think that nationally, Minnesota is in a much better position than most states because it does have such a large budget reserve. There's also a cash flow account that has some monies available. But veteran lawmakers will tell you that there's always pots of money that can be found in the state budget, right? And so there are ways that they can try to plug the budget holes, but I think they'll be looking to their federal counterparts to help alleviate that. And if so, I mean, I think that will dramatically lower the stakes. The one thing that I see sort of having some impact on next year's legislative session, which no one will say this, but at least publicly, but we all know it happens. But the 2022 race for governor, you're going to see people who are interested in running for governor, maybe positioning themselves, during the legislative session. I think there are people both. I mean, I think Walz is expected to run for re-election, but you will nonetheless have Republicans, potentially positioning themselves for a run. And if they are in the legislature, there's always that effect. In terms of the three players, Speaker Hortman, Leader Gazelka, and Governor Walz, their first go at a budget was when all three were new to the roles, right? And so I think Gazelka more than Hortman or Walz might be under more pressure to try to push for state these agency cuts, right? And anything that sort of pushes the needle towards a more conservative point of view on how the state budget should operate, because he is getting pushback on certain things. I mean, I know he's got some pushback on the fact that they passed such a large bonding bill, right? And so if someone like him were wanting to run for governor, his base would want to see those conservative bona fides sort of play out next year.
So the other thing, Briana, so we talk about the fact that we actually have now, we for the longest time before COVID, we did not have a deficit. We had a money in what's called the rainy day fund. We had money, right, that was meeting the budget needs, but now we have a deficit. But the question is, what's the deficit? Because I believe there was an estimate right around the time the worst of the first lockdown happened. But there has been economic activity. So do we know if that's actually gotten any better since those earlier estimates?
We can guess that it might have. I mean, there was a kind of unprecedented update in May, looking ahead to not only this 2-year budgeting period, but also to the next one, which they have to confront in January. And it was over $2 billion for this current budget period, and then $4.7 billion for the next 2-year budget, which is striking. I remember my first session I covered in 2011 was the projected $6.2 billion budget deficit, which went down a little bit, but I mean, this is a projected whopper. We haven't seen anything like it. And as you said, at the start of the last legislative session, they had a 1.5 billion projected budget surplus. So this is a huge turnaround. Legislators haven't had to deal with this in a while. And I don't know exactly. I mean, I chatted with Governor Walz for a story with a colleague about this, and he said he's leaving everything on the table. He didn't even close the door necessary on budgetary shifts, which he said it was a big part of how they closed the gap actually in 2011 was they, shifted a bunch of money dedicated to school districts. And he said at the time he was very critical of it, but now he kind of looks at it and he says, I get why they do that. It's really hard, and it's really hard.
So if we're looking at a budget shortfall, and the Republicans and Democrats both have control in this process because the Republicans control one chamber in the House, but we know Republicans in general don't like the idea of raising taxes. What about, here's an idea. What about legalizing marijuana? Because you can tax it and then that brings in money, and you're both smiling. But do we know where? I think my sense is that on the House side, there is support in the DFL caucus there for this idea. But is there support among the Republicans who control the Senate, Ricardo, for legalizing marijuana?
No, that's the short answer.
No. So no. All right,
No.
we can move on.
I mean, I would say no, and the reason I was smiling is because before I came back to Minnesota this year, I was in California and was covering sort of the expansion of legalized marijuana at the city level. A couple of years after that. So there's a lot of policy problems that have wound up that Republicans could easily point to if they wanted to shoot that out. But the fact that they hold this majority in the Senate, tells me that that's not an issue we're likely to see move next year.
Yeah, I can't think of one Republican who would peel off on that. I think they would be a pretty strong on that. Walz said that was one option on the table. He said, I would love to do that, take those revenues and put that toward, I don't think the state would start to see revenues though. For a few years, it would take a little while to establish a program, but it could be a revenue source going off into future budgets.
So to go back to what you were just saying, Briana, and I think I know the answer, but have any of these leaders staked where they say the priority is? If we have a deficit, we have to save this, or we have to let this go. Is there a list? Has anyone said anything?
Not really. I think that everybody's, Walz has said he'll leave everything on the table. House Speaker Melissa Hortman did say that she would look at, sort of corporate loophole type tax increases, sort of closing some of those loopholes that they think will raise some revenue. They think that's an obvious starting point, but Republicans have said, have been a pretty hard no on other proposed tax increases, including, proposed gas tax increase. So I would imagine that's, Gazelka said in a video after he was reelected that, they'll agree with what they need to agree on and stop what they need to stop. So he hasn't given a ton of specific yet. And I think that's by design. I think everybody wants to sort of have meetings with this new caucus and see where they're going to go.
Do either of you see any policies that may not be related to the budget, but just things that are out there that are ideas for bills to pass that might be bipartisan, that might get votes in the Senate and in the House, and therefore, and then the governor supports it, so that in addition to whatever we have to crank out on the budget, that there will be common ground found on topic A, B, or C? Do either of you have any in mind on where something like that could be found?
Just off the top of my head, I'm thinking about some of the health and human services. There's a lot of audits that were found, right? Around sort of the mismanagement of some programs there. I know that Governor Walz has acknowledged some issues there. That's always been an agency that's experienced problems that both Democrats and Republicans have tried to address. So that could potentially be one. I know that Senate Minority Leader Susan Kent told me in terms of potential taxes that they would want to see on the table is again reinstituting taxes on tobacco. I think a few years ago there was a big win for tobacco when they rolled back some of those taxes on certain tobacco products. So would Republicans hold firm on that? I think in the end you kind of never know what specific issues end up in the mix in terms of what some caucuses are willing to let go in exchange for another. but I think something like tobacco is an issue that is a solved health issue, and would Republicans agree to something like that? I would wager that's something they'd be more comfortable with versus the closing of corporate tax loopholes, because the fact is there are a lot of business groups that would rather see something like that happen over tobacco. So specific policies, I mean, I think if Democrats had won back the majority in the Senate, they would have obviously pushed for paid family leave. I don't think that's likely. I think that's something that's seen very much as a massive expansion of state governments. That would be very costly. But I mean, I think right now it's still maybe a little too early to say what specific policy priorities might be on the table next year that could garner bipartisan support. But there might be some low-hanging fruit.
One that I would just add is what's being called the Page Amendment, which is a constitutional amendment that's revenue neutral, that it essentially put constitution language that makes an education available to everybody, no matter who they are, where they live. This is one that cuts across strange political lines. Some Republicans love it, some hate it, some Democrats love it, some hate it. The teachers union does not like it at all, but some other education groups do. But what I've heard from some folks is that they're going to be seeking to push it again, especially as COVID has exposed, even more intense racial disparities in the state and in the nation, that they feel that this is more of a time to do this than ever. But, Education Minnesota is a powerful figure in the Capitol, and they do not support this. And I imagine there'll be a strong no against it. So they'll have to come to some kind of agreements there on that. It'll be interesting to watch. I do know groups are looking to bring that back.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a really good point, Briana, because it just made me think about, COVID has sort of highlighted the disparities in education in a more even serious way, but even George Floyd's, death has sparked sort of this reckoning on race that also, a lot of progressive activists, particularly those who work in education, have said, well, we're talking about the racial disparities in law enforcement and policing, but we should also be talking about the education in a significant way. And last year when the Page amendments, had sort of come on the scene at the legislature, you saw divisions among Democrats on it. You saw, divisions in the People of Color and Indigenous Caucus about who supported it, right? In the House, I think it was sponsored by State Representative Briana Bierschbach out of St. Paul. And so you're going to see some more pressure on that from some members of that caucus. And the Senate TFL is going to come in with a number of new members who belong to that caucus, and State Representative Mary Kunesh-Podein is joining the Senate. Omar Fateh, who knocked out State Senator Jeff Hayden for in that race. Also Aaron Murphy. So you're going to see folks really come in, and if they don't make noise on that, I would be very surprised. But that's one that definitely has Republican support, and if they can start to splinter off more support from Democrats, Education Minnesota will have to come up with some type of rebuttal to what they're saying.
And the People of Color and Indigenous Caucus, I believe, is larger now too. There are more people members who will be in that caucus. So we're talking with Briana Bierschbach from the Star Tribune and Ricardo Lopez from the Minnesota Reformer. This is a Citizen League event, and we have actually, just a quick note, we have a bunch more events coming up just in the next week. So head to citizensleague.org. More policy conversations in different areas coming up, and all of that is online as well. So the other thing that has to happen is, because we had the census this year, we have to redraw all the lines. I have a map right here behind me, but that's not the map of redistricting. But we have to figure out what is the size of this district, what is the size of that district. We don't actually have the numbers yet, so we don't know if Minnesota on the federal level will keep all 8 congressional districts. But Briana, I don't think it looks all that good that we will. It looks like we're probably going to lose a seat, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, Minnesota is growing, but it's not growing as fast as some other states. So that is kind of the big issue for us. And I think that, there have been some troubles with the census. It ended a little bit earlier, and people were still trying to reach people they hadn't been able to reach. So there's concerns about Minnesota's count and if everyone was reached and counted. So yeah, it could be. We haven't lost one in quite some time. We've been on the edge for a number of redistricting now, but this would be a huge deal. Have to, I mean, they have to redraw the that is constitutionally dictated to the legislature to do. So the legislature has to draw something and send it to the governor, which is what they've done for the past few decades. But because of divided government, it's always gotten to courts. So it's likely that that could happen again. I don't know. Maybe with some of these close majorities, they try to find agreement or try to, try to get some maps together that the governor can sign for the first time in a long time. I don't know. I'm not confident that I'm skeptical that that would happen. And, Minnesota does have pretty fair districts. But you look at other states where, there's one party control and people have claimed that the lines are more gerrymandered so that one party can dominate the other. Wisconsin is an example that's gone to the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court. Minnesota, because it's always gone to the courts, people have said they're pretty fair maps. But yeah, losing of a congressional seat, I mean, that, and another dynamic that always happens in redistricting is people get put in the same districts. So you have legislators suddenly have to go up against their friends or their colleagues because they're suddenly in the same district. A lot of tough decisions are made out of it, no matter who ends up.
Well, just on that last point, if we lose a seat, it's possible that Greater Minnesota gets consolidated. So the 8th district, which is the Arrowhead, and you have the 7th district, which is Western Minnesota. Suddenly, maybe, who knows, right? Maybe you just cut across Northern Minnesota. Maybe Pete Stauber and Michelle Fischbach, who knows, right? They're both Republicans. Maybe they're in the same district. But regardless of whether we lose a seat at the federal level, and that really just changes the maps, at the state level, when you draw state representative districts and state Senate districts, that number doesn't change. So the number of districts there doesn't change, Ricardo. Therefore, the lines will be drawn to reflect the fact that people have moved within the state. And big picture, there has been more growth in the metro than in Greater Minnesota. And so it seems like on the state level, and again, we may not get that agreement in the legislature, it may all go to the courts, but in general, if you're just drawing lines around numbers of people, the metro area might be in line for another district or two. And when the state Senate is only controlled by one, that there could be some real ramifications there, couldn't there?
Absolutely. I mean, that was another reason that we had in our explainer in terms of why Democrats didn't perform as well in trying to flip the Senate, and it has to do with the lines, right? I mean, a lot of the population growth, as you pointed out, has been in the metro. There's also been a substantial amount of growth in the Rochester area, which has pushed that first congressional district a little bit more blue. If it's enough growth to really affect the state representative maps or state Senate maps in Rochester, I'm not clear, but absolutely in the metro. And so that could be a really interesting fight that we see. And Briana pointed out, these always end up being litigated. And it's absolutely one that all parties will be keen on doing that again to ensure fairness, right? And so I think what the results in this election showed, obviously, is that the Twin Cities Metro, candidates who are running statewide, they can sort of run up the board in the metro and still be elected despite not having a whole lot of support out in rural Minnesota. And so that is something that folks will be very keen on keeping in mind as those maps are redrawn.
And it's interesting too that, for example, the Rochester example you just gave right now, Rochester is covered by 2 state Senate districts, and both of those senators are Republicans. Well, if that were to be redrawn, where Rochester as itself is a Senate district, I think, right, you could make the argument that then becomes a bluer district, and that would benefit the DFL. Native American reservations in northern Minnesota are split between several districts. And so how those maps are drawn really becomes a thing. And so just to reiterate what Briana says, the legislature and the governor do have first crack. You can try to come to an agreement, but what has never or has not happened in the last generation is that they don't come to an agreement. So judges, the courts draw the map. How does that play out? It's just, do you remember how did you cover 10 years ago? I'm trying to remember exactly how it plays out. I think both sides get to submit maps, and then the judges kind of go from there. Is that right?
Yeah, the minority parties, whoever they are, submit maps, even if they know they're not going to get a good. I mean, I think the last time this happened, actually, Republicans controlled the entire legislature and the governor. So the minorities submitted their ideal maps. The Republicans, drew their own and submitted those to the governor anyway, and he vetoed them. And then what happens is a panel is formed of judges who consult with GIS experts who really, I mean, it's fascinating to think of, these judges who are not map makers having to preside over this process. But I mean, it has resulted in people on both sides have told me this. It has resulted in pretty fair maps. I mean, I do think that Democrats missed a golden opportunity to have complete control over the whole process. But as you pointed out, Tom, they might benefit no matter what if they're drawn by the courts because of these big population shifts that we're seeing. But yeah, it'll be fascinating to watch. We have experts on both sides kind of weighing in on the process, people testify in front of the courts about what they think, don't divide this community from this community. This should be where this line goes. I mean, it is down to the street, the streets specific. It's very fascinating.
Well, between a response to COVID, which you would argue we have to have, a response to the budget, which we have to have, and a redrawn map, which we have to have, what the heck else could we possibly get to in this session, Ricardo? Is all the oxygen gone for this session with just those three things?
I mean, setting a budget alone is a big lift. And you start tacking on some of these other items, and it gets to be even bigger. But again, I think, as you'd mentioned earlier, the size of whatever federal financial aid package comes down the pipeline will really, really determine how much pressure state lawmakers feel under. One thing that had been floated by some candidates, sort of back to this redistricting question. I remember talking to one DFL candidate for the Senate who had told me, sort of this distrust by people of elections and governments. What about the idea of nonpartisan sort of commission forms that can draw these lines, right? And that was something I asked Senate Minority Leader Susan Kent about it, which she was open to. She said that was something she was open to, with the caveat being that it's sort of an advisory type of commission, right? Not one that has the final say on what the maps look like. So you might see some sort of proposals like that, but I would say that political party leaders are going to be loath to have that sort of power moved away from them. But you might see some sort of compromise around that on that. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of next year's legislative session, you're going to see lawmakers sort of triage a little bit, I think, right? We don't get a budget. If we don't get a 2-year budget, we start shifting towards state government shutdown, which Minnesota has seen before. So I think, lawmakers are typically known for sort of kicking the can down the road. So I think they'll focus on the things that they have, agreement on first to get those done, and then we'll see what else happens.
I want to get to a few other questions that are also online here on our Q&A chat within this session. When we were talking about the budget, ways to maybe raise more money, Ricardo put the kibosh on recreational marijuana. What about sports betting? Supreme Court ruling a few years ago allowed states to regulate sports betting in a way they never really had before, except for like Vegas and Atlantic City. I think South Dakota just passed sports betting by referendum in this election a week ago. Is that, and I just, this can be just kind of a quick answer, but what do you think? Is sports betting on the table, Briana?
There are certainly some legislators who would really like it to be. It's been pretty politically fraught, and given a lot of the similar same leadership that we have, I would guess it would be a challenge to pass something like that.
Okay, so then the other question I have here is, especially we actually have someone who's watching from living in greater Minnesota on a farm, and their big issue is rural broadband. Just as we are literally sitting here distance learning, I was asking you earlier, Ricardo, if there's common ground on something like a rural broadband to boost all of the capabilities throughout the state, especially with kids learning online at school. Can we add that to the list, or is rural broadband pretty bipartisan or not? I don't actually know.
I mean, I think that one is definitely one that had seen some support, and I want to say that there was some money allocated to that this past year, or even in this bonding session. I mean, I don't want to be wrong on that, but something sort of pops out in my memory about something like that. But that is an easy one that could have bipartisan support. I mean, I think, COVID has obviously highlighted the need for people to be able to have reliable and fast internet to be able to do things like what we're doing now. So, so I think that one is one of those low hanging fruits that I was talking about earlier.
It's worth adding just a quick note here, Briana, that because we're doing this redistricting, and I'm going back and forth a little bit, and I apologize for that, but because we're doing redistricting, everyone is on the ballot again in 2 years. Even though in the Minnesota State Senate, the term is usually 4 years, because we just redrew the maps, we all get to do this all again with the new maps in 2022. Plus there'll be a governor's race and all the statewide, your auditor, your secretary of state, your attorney general, all of that. We're just, the bonanza.
We're going to have a do-over plus, walls at the top of the ticket, which is, he did have some down ballot impacts, I think, in 2018, and Klobuchar was on the ballot then too. And I think Democrats saw that helped them. But you have to remember, midterm elections are often a challenge for the party that's in power, which appears to be trending toward Joe Biden. We'll have to see how the transition goes, but assuming Joe Biden is in power, it might be a little bit tougher for Democrats. We'll have to see. I mean, there's so much that can happen in a week here in this new world we live in, no less a few years. But yeah, we are going to have a huge battle again for complete control of government.
Yeah,
a ton of outside cash.
And just a note here, I think Krista, who's watching Ricardo on this webinar, was following rural broadband pretty closely, because she notes here that there was a bill to allocate 8 million and it did not pass. But if we had rural broadband, says Shannon, Ricardo could have done this webinar from a yurt, which is absolutely true. So in our last 10 minutes here, I want to also get a sense from both of you. So we've talked about the big things that are the obvious policies, but as reporters, I know that there are things that you just either it's a hobby horse kind of a thing, you like to cover this topic, or there's always that bill that comes up that you're interested in, even though it doesn't really get a ton of attention. What are those for you? I just want to know, what are your favorite, maybe they're a little quirky, maybe they're idiosyncratic, or maybe they're actually quite consequential, but they never get the time of day at the Capitol. So I'm putting you on the spot here, but if either of you have like your favorite you have the folder over here for if you get a light day, what's the thing you like to cover? Either of you can jump in if you.
Yeah, I'll say one thing I love to look for are those little word changes. So like an example is amendments to change wording, and I mean, this isn't a little word change, this is a big one, wording in the Constitution that allows slavery if someone commits a felony, right? Which is of course outdated language, which the state does not use, but people have said, why do we have this? And there's been others. Last year, there was a move to the state law books actually prohibited women from committing adultery. And there was, penalties for that, even though of course no one actually, instituted any penalties. So it's sort of like these little tiny changes that are symbolic, but really mean a lot to people in terms of updating our very old statute books, are so fascinating to me because they show us so much about where our state has come and sort of where it hasn't, right? Like the fact these things still exist on the books. So I'm always watching for little things like that. A few of issues I'd covered pretty intensely over the years are less so now. There was a big battle over the constitutionality of the sex offender treatment program, which used to be this all-consuming issue. It's not really as much anymore because of a federal ruling there. I cover a lot of, policies for women, which I think I'm going to be watching for. Pay is one for both men and women, but women have talked about women's groups have pushed pretty hard at the legislature, but other equity measures that I'm always interested in for gender and racial equity.
Yeah. Ricardo, what's your extra folder here that you save for?
I mean, I always love sort of gathering string on sort of two types of stories. I love doing the stories that sort of show how influence moves in the Capitol. Showing who's driving a certain policy or who's driving certain bill and sort of trying to peer behind the curtain about what powerful interests is having their water carried by lawmakers. Love doing those types of stories. But the other ones that I thoroughly enjoyed and have sort of done over the years since covering Minnesota politics is how things around racial justice, racial equity plays out at the Capitol. I mean, I think when I first started covering the Capitol, the number of people of color in the legislature was minuscule. It's still pretty small now, but it's grown. And so I've looked, when I was at the Star Tribune, I did stories about the challenges for first-time candidates. I did efforts under former Governor Mark Dayton to make state government more racially diverse. Efforts that have continued under Tim Walz. And I think we're seeing continued gains in both the House and the Senate this year on those fronts. So last summer when we saw sort of this really contentious debate in the Senate, where DFL senators of color had felt completely sidelined by their Republican colleagues when it came to sort of crafting that police reform bill. I mean, that was a remarkable moment to witness, given what was some of the comments that were made, and just kind of so fresh off of George Floyd's killing, the tensions were really high, and I think that was something that I think I wrote about it, and I know Briana, I think you wrote about it as well, and others followed. But I mean, I think these are the types of issues that, as much as possible, I try to explain what is happening and give that type of context. And I always kind of love, as much as possible, learning what makes politicians tick. So writing those stories that kind of show why people are in the jobs that they are in, and how those sort of dynamics play out, and when it comes to sort of passing policies or setting a budget.
So the final thing I want to grab a hold of here, because the Citizens League is rooted in the idea of getting people interested in policy and advocating for it as well. And because of COVID, whether or not, for example, how a bill becomes a law, it has to go through a committee first, then it goes to the floor. And some of those committees, I don't actually know, are all those committees still virtual? Are some of them in person? The actual sessions, when it goes to the floor, some people are there physically, but others are still virtually joining on Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever software they use. So how can people, I care about this topic and I want to talk to my lawmaker. And in the past, it's to say, I'm going to go to the Capitol on Mental Health Awareness Day because my lobbying group really cares. And so you've walked through so many of these events in the rotunda where we're advocating for this topic or that topic. And it doesn't seem like that's going to be at the Capitol this year in a budget year. And this thing that's so near and dear to my heart that never gets any attention, all I want is to talk to the one person on this committee to see if this could be the year. How do people do that this year? How, and I suppose the question exists also for people who are actual lobbyists, day to day, but do you have any insight on how, especially the folks here who are members of Citizens League, how can they engage and not feel like they're falling into a void of emails and tweets that the member of the legislature will never see because that's the only way we're communicating? How can I lobby?
I can start. That's a good question. I mean, transparency has suffered so greatly. I mean, there were barricades around the Capitol. I couldn't even get in September wandering the tunnels trying to find my way to a press conference that was happening. I don't think that that's going to change necessarily. I really do think there's going to be a lot of restrictions coming in given the spike we're seeing in COVID cases. I did a guide for MinPost when I worked there 2-3 jobs ago. That was kind of about this. It had a lot of the more traditional means, right? Go to the Capitol, as you said, go to testify in a committee. But it did have some tips that might be helpful here, which is, really find the person you need to reach out to. So look for the committee chair that specifically, instead of, blanket emailing whoever, find the committee chair, find the aide, or find the specific person who can actually help with the issue you're looking at. Find your legislator, and make sure it's clear to them. And I'm your constituent and I have a problem, make it clear that that you care about this, whatever it is, and why. Put your address in there. Make sure they know that you live in their district and that you want them to hear what what you feel about some of these proposals coming through. I think sometimes sending big form letters is effective, but a lot of times I've heard legislators say that turns them off. So try to make it personal, try to make it clear who you are and what your story is and why it really matters. All those things could maybe help in this pretty unprecedented.
But it's still hard, it's just going to be hard. Ricardo, would you?
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna say it's kind of this double-edged sword, right? Because both we're seeing less transparency in the crafting of legislation. I mean, a lot of these lawmakers are having, are hashing out details of legislation by phone or by Zoom conference, and they're sort of, having these in their respective caucuses, which to me sort of raises questions about open meeting laws, because it's like, even though they might not necessarily have a quorum, you're still having legislation that's being talked about and hashed out, largely out of public sight. And so that transparency question continues to trouble me. But I think in terms of access for citizens, I mean, I think it might even be easier in some cases, depending on where you live, to reach your lawmaker via Zoom or via phone call, right? But some legislators have told me that they, when they hear from their constituents or they hear from people who are wanting to push a policy, they want people who come prepared with an idea, right? They don't just want to hear, there's a problem and you need to fix it. They want a problem identified and some potential, options, right? That the legislator can then do something with. And so that's usually helpful, is that sort of head start and that kind of homework. But as Briana pointed out, form letters are not necessarily the best way, but pointing out that you are a constituent is a big one. Committee chairs are also very important, but if you just reach out to your specific lawmaker and impress on them that you are their constituents, this is your problem, this is what I need help with, maybe come with an idea of how they go about addressing it, I think your chances of getting some meaningful attention are much higher.
One quick plug for nonpartisan staff too. They're incredibly helpful. They might answer, you might just have a question, right? Like, is this an issue? I don't understand this. You could ask anyone. You can find them, not fiscal analysts for any kind of budget areas. I find them to be the most invaluable resource, and they are, I'm sure, very happy to answer the public's questions as well.
Thank you for that. There was a great question that just came in that said, well, if Gazelka wants to run for governor, but he has to run for state senate again, maybe that's a reason he won't run for governor. And I'm just going to leave it there because we don't have time to answer it, but it's a great question and another reason to come back and talk about more of the really political stuff happening as well too. I highly encourage everybody. I suspect a lot of people who are watching already do, but you should follow Briana and Ricardo on Twitter. They are both pretty easy to find. It's B Bierschbach on Twitter, and then it's RL Journo for Ricardo, and you just search their name and Twitter and all of that. Please follow the Citizens League on Twitter as well, just at Citizens League. And tomorrow at noon, Citizens League is having a conversation on how transportation policies can affect communities. It's going to be a panel that takes a deep dive into the lasting effects of development on I-94 through the Rondo neighborhood. So sign up for that at citizensleague.org. I'm not actually sure if we're still on, but if we are, thank you all for being here, and thank you for joining us, and we will have more events in the future.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Tom.
Thanks.
Thank you.